Okay, I'm Ian Merwin, and this is Black Diamond Farm and Cider. And we're in our press room. We actually use this as a primary fermentation room as well. Just do a quick walkthrough here. So we press 3,000 to 4,000 gallons a year. We could go up to 6 if we needed to, and some years we do, but usually around 3,500, 4,000 gallons of cider. And this is where we press it. This is a rack and cloth press, so it's a traditional cider press system based on hydraulic press. So when we're pressing here, we can bring the bins of fruit in back there where my truck is parked, and I'll usually line out 5 or 6 bins. That's a typical day's work. And we have one person loading the fruit into the hopper, and that's a grading point where if there's any rot in the fruit, we pull those out. They go into the compost pile. Goes up the elevator here. This is an old New England made out of oak. It's a 100-year-old elevator there. Goes up there, drops into this is the grinder, and that's what's called a hammer knife or a flail grinder. And it turns the apples into applesauce that drops out here, and then we build up layers, successive layers of what's called the cheese. And usually it's 5 layers on this press. And then we slide it here under the press plate, and typically we'll get about 18, 20 gallons per squeeze. But the way this is set up, this is pressing the previous batch while you're building this cheese, and then somebody can be loading out the pumice out through the back door. So the throughput's pretty good. This is a bladder press, which we use for grapes. Occasionally I'll do a test batch of cider there as well. And then we have slab heat in the floor here, so we can maintain this room at about 60 degrees. And that's the temperature I usually like to have for our primary fermentations. We ferment in 1,000-liter tanks. So 1,000 liters is about 275 gallons per tank. They're variable capacity where the lid floats on the cider. And by regulating the floor temperature in here, I can influence the tank temperature. And so we can fit 3 of those tanks on the side of this room here. And usually what we're aiming for is a very slow, cool fermentation. 60 degrees is low enough to slow the yeast down, but not so. If you get down into the 50s, you can stress the yeast, and then you start to get dihydrogen sulfide and other off aromas because the yeast is stressed. So we want to keep the yeast happy. Our fermentations, we do a pet nat, so we have some, wild fermentations. All of our ciders start with a week. We don't use any SO2 until we're ready to bottle, and then it's just to make sure it's stable in the bottle. And so we'll press the cider into the tank, wait for usually a week, and that gives the wild yeast that are in the cider a chance to get going. And then usually I'll add we use a lot of DV10, a lot of standard champagne yeasts. So what we end up with is a sort of a mixture of wild yeast and yeast strain fermentation. That means that every batch is going to be a little bit different, but it gives us a complete fermentation through the end. I usually try to avoid stuck fermentations. We don't use any yeast nutrients. Again, we want a slow fermentation. I found years ago when I used to feed the yeast that you just get a faster fermentation, and the yeast use up the nutrients, and then they get stressed, and it works better for us to just let the yeast do their thing. So when the tank is done, we'll move it into this room. It's a little noisy in here from the refrigeration unit, but so this cider is aging. We have 5 of those tanks, and we got some smaller ones that we do test batches in, and then we have 2 bright tanks one of them we mostly use for storage. You can see if you look at the dates here, we usually age our ciders for at least 5-6 months. Sometimes we'll age them in here for a year. So this was pressed on Halloween last year, so 11 months. This one's empty, this one's empty. This is our solstice blend that was pressed December 10th last year. This is a 100% Porter's Perfection that we're going to blend off with another tank. And this is a 100% Harry Masters Jersey that'll get blended as well. That'll be our Somerset Jersey blend. This tank is empty. We've got a Perry back there. We haven't sold a Perry yet, but a lot of our ciders have some pears in the blend. A lot of our blends do. And so this is the aging room for the ciders. And most of our ciders, like a tank like this, there's a dozen different apples in that tank. So we're pressing those mixed sharp bins that we looked at before. And often we might make cider that's a third this tank, and a third that tank, and a third that tank. So they're really the art in cider making is the blending. Up to that point, it's kind of biology and apple growing and sanitation. And when you get to the point where you're making a blend, usually Chris and Dominic and I are all involved in that. At that time of year, we'll be tasting 1 or 2 days a week in the afternoon, usually the end of the day. These tanks have what's called a tasting valve on them where you can crack it and fill your glass, so you can continuously sample what's happening in the tank. And that's how our ciders are made. Okay, so I mentioned that when you make cider, no apples go to waste. And this bin here, these are bins, they hold about 800, 900 pounds of fruit. And you can see this has got about 7 or 8 different varieties in it. Some are dessert apples, some are cider apples. And this is what we call a mixed sharp bin. We sell bins of this to people, and we also use it in our blend ciders. And unfortunately, you can't smell anything by video, but if you could smell what this room smells like right now, it's really full of the aromatics from ripe apples. It's really wonderful. So, for the first 7 years that we were making cider commercially, and I should say I made my first batch of cider in 1985 and made a couple of barrels of cider every year. But we didn't get our commercial winery license until 2013, so that's when we kind of got serious about it. That was when I retired from Cornell and finally had time to devote a lot more energy to it. But until last year, we didn't have a place on the farm that we could do tastings, and we still don't have a tasting room like a lot of cideries do, but we have this, which we call our cider shack. And it was a shack that we cleaned up and fixed up enough so we could do small group tastings. So, welcome to our cider shack. We can accommodate groups of, well, in the pre-pandemic era, we could have up to 12 people in here. Now we can only go up to 12 outside. But it's cozy and it's not fancy, but it works. We've had a lot of really great tastings in here. These are the ciders that we make, and this is our little bragging rights thing. We only enter 2 competitions. We do the New York State Governor's Cup, what they call the Great American Cider Competition, and we do Glint Cap every year, which is the biggest cider competition. That's an international competition, and we've done really well when we do enter. We've had 3 best in classes. We had the grand award for the Governor's Cup last year, and so there's the trophy cabinet. The last couple of years we've been doing a lot of single and 2 variety mixes. So I mentioned the Ashmead's Kernel Renette Musquet out there, and that's this one. This is the one that won the Governor's Cup. That's a Golden Russet Porter's Perfection 50-50 blend. This is a very kind of interesting cider that's 100% Geneva tremolets. That's a very intense cider. A lot of acid, completely dry. And I should say our ciders are all either semi-dry or dry. We don't really make a lot of sweet stuff. This would be one of our sweetest. This is the Hickster blend. That's about 1.2% residual sugar, so pretty low. This thing that we have on all of our cider bottles, this is the New York dryness scale, which is, it's very similar to the Riesling dryness scale that you'll see on a lot of bottles of Riesling now. And pretty much just goes from dry to sweet, and it's based on the actual chemical ratio of sugar to acid in the cider. So this one is at the high end of the semi-dry range. And I find it's really helpful in selling cider because unless people know your ciders by name, they really have no idea, looking at the bottle, whether it's going to be dry or sweet or what it's going to taste like. And this really gives them a preview of what's in the bottle and enables them to buy what they want to drink. Okay, so if you want to come out and do a tasting, it's by appointment only. We do groups of 2 to 8, and give us a call and come on out. And either Chris or I will taste through our ciders.
Cider Week Finger Lakes is brought to you by the New York Cider Association and is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors.